Hello Internet, my name is Camomile, I have a GM's Guide, and this is that GM's Guide, but instead of regular, it's on YouTube. Today we're talking about dungeon design. Now there are three keys to designing a good dungeon: nonlinearity, believability, and variety. We're going to start with nonlinearity. In recent years, the dungeon crawl has often been the victim of an overly linear design. The subterranean nature of a dungeon makes it pretty easy to keep players on track, and particularly in the 3rd and 4th edition days, it was often considered close enough to a real dungeon crawl to just have some twists and bends in a linear route without actually branching the corridors at all. You get this sometimes in the Adventurers League too, which I hope is mainly because they need to make sure the adventure takes a specific amount of hours to complete, and having a very open dungeon crawl would interfere with that something fierce. This sounds believability, which we'll talk about later, because a dungeon is almost always a location that would not have such a linear construction. Whether it was intentionally built as a subterranean fortress or it was repurposed as such from a mine or a natural cavern or what have you, there's almost never a good reason for a dungeon to have few or no branching paths. It also removes one of the best sources of fun from a dungeon crawl: exploration, deciding where to go next and slowly filling in the blanks on a map. It even harms challenge, because exploring a challenge and deducing where targets are based on contextual clues from a well-designed dungeon, that's a skill that you can get good at. Even if a party lacks the resources to clear an entire dungeon, they might be able to find the parts they're looking for with some deduction or interrogation. Clever scouting hardly makes a difference if you have to go through nearly every room in the dungeon to reach the goal anyway. So how do you make a nonlinear dungeon? Well, the most basic elements of a dungeon layout are loops and branches. A branch leads to two separate areas that don't lead to one another except by backing up to a branch, but a loop is a series of areas that are all connected to one another. And you're going to see me in this pre-recorded video here struggling to create loops using the prefabricated tiles from Gabriel Picard's Save vs. Cave tile set. And that's not because of a weakness of Gabriel Picard's tile sets, by the way. They're fantastic, and they contain all the little modular pieces that you need in order to create these loops and branches. That's just because creating loops and branches out of any kind of prefabricated tiles takes a little bit of effort and digging around for which tile you need exactly. As you can see, I've already got a big old branch in the crossroads there, in that it leads into 4 different directions, including westwards towards the entrance. Now, a branch provides a simple choice, but if one branch is easily cleared, then it's hardly a branch at all. The party will go down one branch, reach the end, and then turn back and go down the other. But branches can be used to interesting effect if they contain secondary goals, and sometimes it just makes more sense to have a branch than to have a loop. Don't sacrifice believability on the altar of nonlinearity, especially since believable dungeons will have plenty of loops and other nonlinear constructions anyway. For example, the monster's treasury might be located behind a series of traps and guardhouses that branch off of a loop in the dungeon, or perhaps there's a lair of a wyvern that branches off a loop in the goblin's dungeon. In this dungeon that I'm building right here, there's eventually going to be a industrial market type area that will branch off the north end of that crossroads, which is otherwise unconnected to the rest of the dungeon, but which contains a lot of treasure, as well as some allies the party can pick up, depending on what exactly they're doing when they get to this branch, or when they get to this dungeon. On the other hand, the eastern and southern areas are going to be a whole bunch of loops. So that northern area forms a branch with a secondary objective. Now, speaking of loops, those are the cornerstone of nonlinear dungeon design, because they provide the choice of going around encounters. This is particularly true if the dungeon has been alerted to intruders. An encounter might do its damnedest not to be gotten around, but if there's a loop, the party can get around it if they're quick or sneaky enough. Loops let you decide not just what order a party wants to deal with encounters in, but gives them more options for dealing with those encounters, and lets them decide if they want to deal with certain encounters at all. Players skipping an encounter might seem like the encounter is wasted effort, but the ability to skip encounters lets players know they have actual freedom within the world, and that is worth the effort of making a few encounters that get skipped. Hidden entrances, both into the dungeon itself and onto specific dungeon levels, are another way to make loops not just for a few areas, but for entire levels of the dungeon. A second set of stairs, or a ladder or chute or teleporter pad or whatever between levels 1 and 2, that turns the entire dungeon level into a loop. Likewise, if there's a hidden entrance straight into level 3 of the dungeon, then levels 1 to 3 become one giant loop. Readers might reasonably wonder if potentially cutting out 2 entire levels of a dungeon isn't perhaps pushing the limit, sacrificing work for player freedom, but remember, dungeon inhabitants shouldn't be waiting around to be mulched into XP by the player characters. If the players find a hidden entrance to level 3 of the dungeon and they decide to use it, that means there are 2 completely untouched levels of the dungeon lying around to make a reserve force out of, and if that reserve force follows the PCs down, they will be between the PCs and the exit. If the party finds a secret entrance between level 3 and level 4, they can sneak around that reserve force, get to the hidden exit on level 3, and slip out without fighting. But the key word there is if. If the players don't find that hidden connection between level 3 and 4, then in order to get back up to level 3, they will have to use the main stairwell that every spare monster from levels 1 and 2, and any they missed on level 3, is now camping on, because monsters can move. They might start out on level 1, but they'll go down to level 3 if that's where the action is. These are the kind of considerations that make clearing a dungeon feel more like an assault on an enemy fortress and less like a Diablo clone with hideously subpar action resolution speed. Also, listeners may be wondering why I referred to them as readers a little bit ago. That's because I'm just using the GM's Guide itself as a script. I forgot to edit that part, and this was a really good take, so I'm keeping it. Now let's talk about sublevels. Sublevels are when one floor of the dungeon has 2 or more connectors that each lead to a lower level, and these lower levels do not connect to one another. For example, on level 4 there might be 2 different stairways down, one leading to level 5A and the other leading to level 5B, but there are no corridors connecting levels 5A and 5B together. They're completely separate levels of the dungeon, but on the same vertical height. One of these might be a dead end, so for example, the stair down to level 6 might be only on 5A, so if you go into 5B, that's basically just a giant branch, and then you have to back up from 5B back to level 4, find the stairs into 5A, and from there go down into level 6. But they might also have connectors leading down to level 6, on both ends, in which case levels 4 through 6 form yet another loop. If you want to skip the content in level 5A, you can go through level 5B, or vice versa. Non-looping sublevels can be a good way to cordon off an optional subsection of the dungeon, especially one that contains some important side goal. Maybe the goal of the dungeon is to kill the monster's leadership in the fortress on the final level, but there's a sub-level branch that contains their treasury, including several magic items that none of the monsters can use themselves, but which might be helpful to the party, who have a wider variety of character builds and explore a wider variety of fantastic environments. A drift globe might not be very helpful to monsters with dark vision, and a ring of water walking isn't very helpful to a monster who lives in the desert, but a multiracial party probably doesn't all have dark vision, and wandering adventurers are probably going to end up at a large body of water they'd like to walk over sooner or later. Sufficiently large sublevels, looping or otherwise, can be dungeons unto themselves. In fact, one way to make a dungeon in a hurry is to take multiple small ones and Frankenstein them together into a bigger one. You have to be careful about making the seams too obvious, but adding a few connections between a series of natural caverns with goblins, a catacomb overrun by undead, and adding a surface layer that's a small temple of Tiamat controlled by kobolds and dragonborn, that can work. The catacombs were formerly a burial ground for the temple, which was once dedicated to some other god before being seized by the cult of the dragon, and some goblins from a nearby natural cavern broke in mostly by accident while tunneling out some new accommodations. Connect the entrance to the catacomb to a room in the temple, then connect your room somewhere in the cavern to another somewhere in the catacomb. The temple and the cavern both have separate entrances. Even if the dungeons were fairly linear before, for example, if you took a few dungeons from the Adventurers League Adventure for Tyranny of Dragons, you add those connections between them, and bam, you've got loops, multiple entrances, branches, whatever. This is a relatively basic example, and thus the dungeons can get much more complex. For example, imagine 2 or more dungeons that both descend somewhat parallel to one another into the earth. Level 4 of Dungeon A connects to Level 3 of Dungeon B, and then further down, Level 6 of Dungeon A connects to Level 4 of Dungeon B. These kinds of connections are especially useful for mega dungeons, and they won't come up so much if you're hoping to use a dungeon as just one adventure. What you got on screen is a dungeon for just one adventure. I'm really struggling in order to create a whole bunch of loops. This 3-way branch that I've got set up right here is eventually going to connect both to that northwestern room, the big room full of clan skin huts to the east, and the other big room full of... Clan skin is a weird term for that, but I think you know what I mean. The other big room full of huts to the west. So I'm going through quite a bit of effort here in order to stitch them together. We're not actually going to see the end of that result by the end of this video, because it's simply going to take too long, and I'm already out of script, but it's worth the effort to go through, and I was really satisfied with the dungeon I ended up with, which you'll be able to see in Petals and Thorns, Heroes of Ramshorn, coming to Kickstarter within a couple of weeks of when this video will go live. I'll see you there, and also in the next GM's Guide video, when we will continue talking about the secrets to making a good dungeon.